Okay, Numbers chapter 34. Why is Numbers called Numbers? Y'all are speaking softly, but how about a little louder? Why is Numbers called Numbers? What's counted? The Israelites are counted, right? At the beginning of Numbers, which is right before they left Mount Sinai, God commanded them to take a census of all the men 20 and above who could go out to war, and there was 603,550. And then because of sin and unfaithfulness, general disobedience and rebellion, God killed them one after another, sometimes thousands at one time. But after 40 years, I'm looking at Numbers 26 and verse 51, they still numbered 601,730. So there's still quite a few. There's a drop of 1,820 people, which is a testimony to God's faithfulness. God stuck with Israel, and He tolerated their weaknesses as He does me and you. That's part of the reason why we study the Old Testament, right? Because it illustrates to us the nature of God, both His goodness as well as His severity. In Romans chapter 11 and verse 22, I believe it is, the Apostle Paul says, "Behold the goodness and severity of God." And so study of the Old Testament history reveals both sides of God's nature, the good side and the not so pleasant side. And the not so pleasant side is not pleasant because of our disobedience, right? All right, as we get into Numbers chapter 34, what is the theme of chapter 34? Dividing up the land. All through the book of Genesis, God has promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob over and over again, I'm going to give you the land of Palestine. I'm going to give you the land of Palestine. The whole purpose of God giving Israel the land of Palestine, right, is because Jesus has to come into the world. That's the whole purpose. So that they'll have a place to live, so that they'll be a family with a virgin through whom Jesus can come. And that's the reason why there's no purpose for the land of Palestine today in God's plans. That's the reason why premillennialism is false. And so in this chapter, God says it's time for you to divide up the land. Now, He had already told them back in chapter 26 that they were going to divide up the land, and the larger tribes are going to get more land, and the smaller tribes are going to get smaller amounts of land. And that only makes sense, right? And so the Lord spoke to Moses, verse 1, verse 2, "Command the sons of Israel, when you enter the land, here's your southern border, here's your northern border, here's your eastern border, and here's your western border." I've got a map that will show you that to you, and you probably have the map in your mind already, but I'm going to show you the map in just a second. But I want to go ahead and answer this next question. By what name is the Sea of Kinnereth, which is mentioned in verse 11, by what name is the Sea of Kinnereth referred to in the New Testament? The Sea of Gennesaret? Galilee? Sea of Tiberias? Remember, this land has been taken over several times by the Greeks and the Romans, and so it's not unusual for places to change names. So here is a map of Israel. So there's the northern border. Now, it mentions on the northern border Mount Hor, verse 8. And I just happened to double check today, and archaeologists don't know exactly where Mount Hor is located. So the border that you see on the screen might not be exactly right. As I've mentioned before, these places where Israel went we don't know where a lot of them are today. I mean, you're looking at 1,500 years before Jesus came. So, but roughly speaking, there's the northern border there. There is the Jordan River here. There's the tribes of Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh over there on that side, which is the eastern side, Dead Sea. down here, kind of squiggly line there, and then the Mediterranean Sea, of course, on the western side. The borders changed, of course, over the years when King David ruled, and King Solomon, really it was King David because he was the king who shed blood, right? The border reached its extent. The largest Israel ever was under King David and King Solomon, but Solomon inherited the borders. It was really King David. Solomon did it through marriages. That was alliances that he made. But anyway, that's the nation of Israel. And as far as geographical extent is concerned, it's roughly the size of New Jersey. Anybody been to New Jersey? 1, 2, 3, 4. You went under New Jersey? Dale's not a fan of New Jersey. When we went to New Hampshire last week or week before last, we went through the airport in Newark. Can't judge much by the airport. But anyway, size of Israel is about the size of New Jersey. So it's not a very big place. And so verse 13, the Lord commanded, this is the land you are to apportion. Notice again in verse 13, this is what the Lord has commanded. So the Lord spoke in verse 16 and said, choose some men to assist you. So who was chosen to assist Moses in dividing the land? Eleazar, priest, and Joshua, who didn't have a father, right? He was the son of Nun. Okay, so then he took one man from each of the 12 tribes, and these men are not the same ones that were chosen in the first part of the book to help with the census, and it's not any of the families that were chosen in the first part of the book. Completely same tribes, obviously, but different families, different individuals. Of course, the individuals from the early chapters are dead, because this is 40 years later. But these men, I double-checked today, and they're also different families. So 12 men are working with Joshua and Eleazar to divide up the land. Chapter 35. What is the theme of chapter 35? Cities. The cities that the Levites got, for at least 6 of them were for cities of refuge. And we're going to talk about what that purpose is in just a moment. Notice the Lord spoke to Moses, verse 1, verse 2, command the sons of Israel that they give the Levites cities and their pasture lands. So how many cities total were given to the Levites scattered throughout the land of Israel? 48 total. Now what was significant about 6 of them? Those were cities of refuge. Now notice in verse 4, the pasture lands of the cities which you shall give to the Levites shall extend from the wall of the city outward 1,000 cubits around, which is 1,500 feet. Based on an 18-inch cubit. You shall also measure outside the city on the east side 2,000 cubits, and on the south side 2,000 cubits, and on the west side 2,000 cubits, and on the north side 2,000 cubits. With the city in the center, this shall become theirs as pasture lands for the cities. Scholars do not know exactly how to interpret 1,000 cubits and 2,000 cubits. In fact, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew, actually says 2,000 in both places. Here is how I picture it. You've got the city in the center, and then you go out 1,000 cubits. The pasture lands goes out 1,000 cubits from the city, and then the border around it is 2,000 cubits, say in a square, 2,000 cubits wide, long, wide, and then across again. That's how I interpret it. So the Levites had all this pasture land, and the question was asked last week. Cody and Dale and I discussed it after class. Who provided all of the animals for the daily sacrifices that were offered all the time? As far as I know, the Bible doesn't say. The Levites had their flocks, Obviously, the Israelites had to offer their animal sacrifices, so did the Levites take from the flocks that the Israelites offered, and then they used those morning and night? I can't presume to know all of the details of the law of Moses. I'm learning it just as well as you are. So if anybody comes across a couple of verses that explains where all those animals came from, if it wasn't from the people, show me where that's found. There are a lot of animals that were sacrificed. Now, relative to those cities of refuge, once Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land and they start dividing up the land, then in Joshua chapter 21, he appoints these cities for the Levites and the cities of refuge. So as I read through chapter 21 of Joshua, I observed that Judah and Simeon together contributed 9 cities to the Levites. The tribe of Naphtali contributed 3 cities, and then all the rest of the tribes contributed 4 cities apiece. And they're really scattered throughout the land, so that there were Levites scattered throughout the land. And then Aaron had, or the family of Levi had the 3 sons who had responsibilities with the tabernacle, you recall, and the sacrifices, Kohath, Gershon, and Merari. And so those were the tribes that contributed cities for those Levites. So the family of Kohath, the Levites from the family of Kohath, settled in Judah, Simeon, Benjamin, Ephraim, Dan, and half of the tribe of Manasseh on the west side. And then Gershon was Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and half the tribe of Manasseh on the east side. And then the family of Merari from the tribe of Levi settled in Reuben and Gad and Zebulun. Looking at that, what conclusion might you draw about God and about the nature of Christianity? And that's a question that's just out there. What do you think? It's all it's all over? Okay, everything's scattered around. Can we make a spiritual application of that? Go out and preach. Go preach the gospel. Everybody's got a responsibility. Everybody's got a task to do. Everybody's got a skill to something to contribute. That's what I draw.
They're all looked at as being equal.
God was constantly dividing things up among the Israelites. God wants everybody to do something so that nobody has to do everything. Yeah, it's like church work. You've heard that 80% of the people do, or 20% of the people do 80% of the work. That tends to be true in the church too. Back in Exodus chapter 21, God is giving details relative to capital punishment. Somebody might kill somebody intentionally, or they might kill somebody unintentionally. In Exodus chapter 21, verses 13 and 14, God says that if a man did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, in other words, it was just accident, God allowed it to happen, then I will appoint you a place to which he may flee. If, however, a man acts presumptuously toward his neighbor so as to kill him craftily, you are to take him even from my altar that he may die. At that particular point, on Mount Sinai, and that's the first 40-day period that Moses was on Mount Sinai, God says, I'm going to appoint you a place where a man can flee if he accidentally kills somebody. Well, it's not until now, at the tail end of that 40-year period, that God says, okay, here's how I want you to divide up the land and how I want you to divide up these cities of refuge. So let's take a look at these cities of refuge. Chapter 35 is where we are. The Lord spoke to Moses. He says, you shall select for yourselves cities, this is verse 11, to be your cities of refuge, that the manslayer who has killed any person unintentionally may flee there. The city shall be to you as a refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer will not die. Again, in verse 15, God says this is for people who killed someone unintentionally. Now, what was God's command for murderers? Those who killed somebody intentionally. Put to death. In fact, if you didn't notice this, notice this. Verse 16, the murderer shall surely be put to death. Verse 17, the murderer shall surely be put to death. Verse 18, the murderer shall surely be put to death. 21, he who struck him shall surely be put to death. He is a murderer. Verse 30, the murderer shall be put to death. What's God's law about murderers? Put them to death. When we lived in Kentucky, our representative was Sandy Overly, and she was constantly sending us, through the mail, constantly sending us surveys to ask us our opinions. What should we do about this? What should we do about this? What should we do about this? What should we do about, what's the term for perpetual drug users? What should we do about them? Well, the reasoning is we can't put them in jail because the jails are full. So I wrote on the survey, execute all the murderers and the rapists, and you'll have more room to put people in jail. I told her that over and over again on the surveys. Of course they're not going to listen because that's not politically correct. God said put murderers to death. Now, who is the one to implement the death penalty? The avenger, and that word in Hebrew is goel, which is also translated redeemer, the kinsman redeemer from the book of Ruth, same word. So the nearest relative tended to be the blood avenger. This is mentioned in verse 19. The blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death.
The one who was murdered, you're saying, the closest relative of this?
The closest relative of the victim, yes, tended to be the blood avenger. I don't know if there's anything that says it had to be the closest relative. Now, the one who accidentally killed somebody, notice in verse 20, if he pushed him of hatred, or verse 21, if he killed him out of enmity, then the blood avenger should put him to death. Then verse 22, if he pushed him suddenly without enmity, or threw something at him without lying in wait, he was not his enemy, verse 23. Then notice in verse 24, the congregation shall judge. You've got a court system. Remember back in Exodus chapter 18, Moses was wearing himself out trying to solve everybody's problems, and God said, divide everybody up, and I'll select men, hundreds and fifties and tens, and we'll create an appellate court system. And if it reaches a point where nobody else knows how to handle it, come to Moses, and Moses will go to God. So the congregation, probably operating through these elders out of the tribes, were to set up a court. The court typically met at the gate. So anytime you see in the Bible where it's references to people sitting in the gate, that's a reference to them being a leader in the community, because that's where they made decisions, where they had court. So the congregation of Israel was to meet in the persons of their judges probably, and they're to hear both sides, and then they're to determine whether or not he intended to do it or if it was an accident. Was there any evidence, any history of hatred, any history of enmity, or not? How did he kill him? It tended to be if it was, let's see, where is it? If it was, look, verse 23, deadly object of stone. You know, unless it was dropped on him, if he was hit in the side of the head, then it's presumed that it was intentional, unless it fell on him from above. So anyway, then verse 25, the congregation shall deliver the manslayer from the hand of the blood avenger and send him to the city of refuge. Now, how long was this unintentional killer supposed to stay in the city of refuge? Until the high priest died. Which means you might be there 6 months, you might be there 30 years.
So would those cities then be inhabited by normal, regular people, or would they not want to live there because it's for people who are...
The presumption is that the cities were occupied by other people, not just these killers. Unintentional killers. Unless you had so many killers that you had a city full of them, in which case nobody else would want to live there. But remember, these are people that the judges determined it happened by accident.
They were to stay there until it was resolved.
They were to stay in the city until the high priest died.
I thought well, except if it was judged by the people.
If he was judged to have intended the murder, then he was put to death, probably stoned to death by the blood avenger.
But like you read in 24, sometimes the congregation of the people had to decide if it was...
Okay, the congregation decided if the killing was intentional or unintentional. If it was intentional, the man was put to death. If it was unintentional, then he was sent to a city of refuge, the closest city of refuge. And there were 6 of them, right? 6 of them scattered throughout Israel. Judy?
I'm confused, I'm sorry.
Uh-huh.
I'm glad she's asking the question she is. Okay, the person commits murder somewhere.
Right.
He flees to the city of refuge? Or what congregation is judging him? When is he judged?
I don't know. It just says the congregation shall judge him. So I'm going to guess wherever the closest, if I killed somebody unintentionally, I'm going to run to the closest city of refuge.
And the city of refuge, I'm sorry.
So the congregation probably is the people that were there close to that city of refuge. I showed where the cities of refuge were divided up among the different tribes. And so they probably had judges from those tribes who could serve as judges, elders from the tribes rather, who could serve as judges over that city of refuge in order to determine if the man was guilty or not.
Verse 12 says they should go to, it should be a refuge until their tribe.
The city shall be to you as a refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer will not die until he stands before the congregation for trial. And then if it's determined that it was accidental, then he stayed there in the city of refuge until the high priest died.
It still seems, he's still not innocent. He still has a punishment, although he didn't intend to do it.
His punishment being that he has to stay in that city for a very long time. If he wanted to live. Because what could happen if the unintentional killer left the city of refuge? He's free game. In fact, in the days of King Solomon, and I should have looked this up, but 2 Kings, no, 1 Kings. There are 3 men that King David leaves in the hands of Solomon to execute judgment on: Adonijah, Joab, and Shimei. 2 of them actually had run to the temple and grabbed a hold of the horns of the altar in order to find refuge there. And I'd have to go back and look, but I've read it recently in the book of Exodus that God said a murderer cannot find refuge in the temple. So apparently that was a practice prevalent among ancient Near Eastern religions, that you could find refuge if you committed murder in their temple. And God says, you're not going to find refuge in my temple. And King Solomon It's one of those three men, and I'm just not finding it here, scanning through the text. But you could read 1 Kings chapter 2 and see which one of those men fit these categories. So it is interesting to me, probably to you too, how God dealt with these kind of crimes under the law of Moses. Any other thoughts or comments? Am I overlooking anything? Could one be put to death at the testimony of one witness? No. If anyone kills a person, I'm reading verse 30, the murderer shall be put to death at the evidence of witnesses, but no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. So at least two or three. And incidentally, when we get into the New Testament times, Jesus also uses that standard of 2 or 3 witnesses. I think it's referred to about 3 times in the New Testament. So somebody comes to the elders and complains about what somebody else has said or done to them, and as far as the elders are concerned, you've got one person's word against another person's. Well, who do you believe? Toss a coin? So Jesus says have 2 or 3 witnesses. In other words, it's one person's word against another.
Maybe that's how the congregation judged whether they were guilty or not, despite witnesses' testimony.
Calling witnesses, surely there was calling witnesses. In fact, we could go back to Exodus chapter 23, I believe, where God gives laws relative to court. And he says you don't take a bribe in court, and you don't distort justice on behalf of the wealthy, and you don't distort justice on behalf of the poor. Justice is to be blind.
I just noticed something there, chapter 22, Exodus 22.
Exodus 22.
It goes through 22 and 23, but it says laws about social justice. We need to read that a little bit more.
Laws relative to social justice.
God.
You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after a multitude in order to pervert justice, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his dispute. You shall not pervert the justice due to your needy brother in his dispute. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent or the righteous, for I will not acquit the guilty. That's a handful of verses from Exodus chapter 23. So before God sets up the cities of refuge system here in the book of Numbers, he's already laid out some rules that he expects them to follow in court. Be fair, and justice should be blind. Could money be paid in lieu of killing the murderers? No. Verse 31, moreover, you shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. You shall not take ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to live in the land before the death of the priest. So, if it's a wealthy man who kills, he can't buy his freedom. Isn't that interesting that God put that in the law a long time before the United States was founded? As I study through the laws of Moses, for example, if you caused an animal to die, then you were to pay the owner so many ox for an ox or so many sheep for a sheep, things like that. As Jewish history progressed, the Jewish rabbi started allowing money to be paid in lieu of exchanging animals. So we actually see that in Jewish history, later on in Jewish history, where they did allow ransoms to be paid. But God specifically says here, no ransom can be paid for murderers. They are to be put to death. And in fact, notice in verse 33, you shall not pollute the land in which you are, for blood pollutes the land, and no expiation can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, am dwelling in the midst of the sons of Israel. So in God's mind, murder pollutes the land. And in fact, in God's mind, there is a number of sins that pollute the land, including sexual immorality. So notice in the book of Leviticus, which we will study together in probably 2 years or so, maybe 3, do not defile yourselves by any of these things. In Leviticus chapter 18, up through verse 23, is already given a number of other sins, like homosexuality and adultery and bestiality and idolatry and other sins. So God says, do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all these the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled, for the land has become defiled, therefore I have brought the punishment upon it, so the land has spewed out its inhabitants. So, what happens when Israel becomes guilty of sexual immorality and idolatry and all of that other stuff? God kicks them out of the land. That's the reason why Israel was exiled under Assyria and Babylon. Because they were committing the exact same sins that the inhabitants had been committing that God drove out. Because God can't dwell in a land that is corrupted by sin. Last chapter, Numbers 36. What's the theme of Numbers 36? Ma'am? It's about marriage and the inheritance of land, right? In fact, we talked about this already. In Numbers chapter 27. Back in Numbers chapter 27, we've got the daughters of Zelophehad. Their dad did not have any sons, right? And the question was, who gets the land? Well, at that time, what did God answer to that question? Who gets the land if a man doesn't have any sons when he dies? The daughters get the land. People today want to say the Bible is misogynistic. The cultures that the Bible dealt with is patriarchal. But the Bible is not misogynistic. There are example after example after example where God respects the rights of women, and this is one of them. And so in that context, in Numbers 27, God says if a man doesn't have any sons, then the daughters get the land. But now they come back and say, okay, we've got another issue. What if these daughters marry into other tribes? If the husbands are in other tribes, then the natural progression is that the land would then go to the father and the sons of that tribe. And if that happens, you might have some tribes and their lands getting larger and larger and larger, and you've got other tribes and their lands getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So now the question is, what do we do about that? So what was God's law relative to daughters who inherited the land when their father died? Stay in your tribe. Marry within the tribe.
I think it's interesting, it says, let them marry whom they think best, but it has to be within the tribe.
Marry who you think is best.
It gives them the freedom to, but it is within limits or within bounds.
And making that point also illustrates that it wasn't necessarily the father who decided who their daughters had to marry. Okay, there's another misconception that fathers in the Bible times decided who they chose their daughters' husbands, and that's not always true. In fact, was it Rachel or Rebekah who their brother said, it was Rebekah, right? Do you want to go with Isaac? Clearly she had the right to say no. And she said, I will go. So here God said, I wanted to point this out. Verse 2, the Lord commanded. My Lord, this is what was commanded by the Lord, verse 2. Verse 5, Moses commanded the sons of Israel according to the word or the mouth of the Lord. Verse 6, this is what the Lord has commanded. You see that statement over and over and over again in the law of Moses. This is what God commanded, and Moses did what God commanded. And then Joshua comes along, and Joshua did what God commanded Moses to do. It is so very important for us to pay particular attention to fulfilling the commands that God has given us.
It's saying here that if a girl marries a guy in another tribe, the inheritance status was it the father's land or was
The girl could not marry from another tribe. She had to marry from her own tribe. Verse 6, this is what the Lord has commanded concerning the daughters of Zelophehad, saying, let them marry whom they wish, only they must marry within the family of the tribe of their father. So Asherites had to marry Asherites, and Reubenites had to marry Reubenites. Okay, at least the daughters whose dad did not have any sons. I don't know if the law applied to everybody or not. Verse 7, thus no inheritance of the sons of Israel shall be transferred from tribe to tribe, for the sons of Israel shall each hold to the inheritance of the tribe of his fathers. Every daughter who comes into possession of an inheritance of any tribe of the sons of Israel shall be wife to one of the family of the tribe of her father, so that the sons of Israel each may possess the inheritance of his fathers. So no inheritance shall be transferred from one tribe to another tribe, for the tribes of the sons of Israel shall each hold to his own inheritance. So these specific daughters had to marry within their own tribe to keep the land within their own family. Dan?
Is that specific to because they didn't have no brothers, or is that a generic law across the board?
Based on what I know right now, I would say it applied to daughters who did not have brothers to inherit the land.
Because if a girl married someone in another tribe, then she would go under their tribe and she would not take any land.
Right. In fact, if a father had a son, then the son inherited the land. So if a daughter then married from another tribe, the land would still stay with the father's tribe. The land would not be transferred. Karen?
Daughters gave up their inheritance and married outside the tribe.
I don't know if that was possible.
Well, it says if they are married to any of the sons of other tribes, then their inheritance will be taken away. You know, it does say it like.
Okay, what verse is that? I just read it, I'm sure. Oh, okay, I skipped that one. If they marry one of the sons of the other, this is verse 3, if they marry one of the sons of the other tribes of the sons of Israel, their inheritance. Oh, this is them presenting the problem to Moses. This is not what God is saying.
They said this.
Right. So I don't know, Karen, if it was possible for daughters to say, I don't care, let my sisters have the land, I want to marry Billy Bob from the tribe of Judah or whatever.
verse 9 said, so that
Right. Right. God wanted the land to stay within the tribes. Each tribe keep its own land. Which really kind of kept things kind of balanced over if they had followed the law, kept it balanced over the years, right? You wouldn't have tribes getting bigger and bigger and richer, and other tribes getting smaller and smaller and poorer and poorer. I don't know if they continued following this practice or not. I doubt they did. They didn't follow anything else consistently. Rachel?
No, I was thinking, unless they had a lot of kids, and I thought, no, the land would still be divided among the kids. It's just the land.
It was divided among the boys, and the oldest son got twice as much, right? Notice again verse 13. These are the commandments and the ordinances. Incidentally, we have no idea what the difference between a command and an ordinance is. There's also the word for rules and the word for statutes. Hebrew scholars do not know what the difference between commands, rules, statutes, and ordinances are. So these are the commandments and the ordinances which the Lord commanded to the sons of Israel through Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan opposite Jericho. This is the last time I'll emphasize this, but that right there is where Moses and Israel is when he gives them the book of Deuteronomy. On the plains of Moab, opposite Jericho, by the Jordan River.
I'm glad we don't marry our own husbands.
There's a joke that family trees in eastern Kentucky have one branch that goes straight up. Any other thoughts or comments or questions on the book of Numbers? Okay, once again, next week we'll be talking about how to be an encourager, how to follow in the footsteps of the son of encouragement, Barnabas, so that we can strengthen each other. Phyllis.
I just wanted to offer thanks and I think you put for my boss on prayer list for possible prostate cancer.
Yes.
Feedback tonight.
Good.
Thank you.
Good. We're glad to hear that he's out of trouble, at least as far as that's concerned. Anything else? We'll have a quick prayer. All right, let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for today, and we're thankful, Father, for this opportunity to study your word. Please bless us as we leave here, Father. Keep us safe. Keep us in your care. We're thankful, Father, for the good news about Phyllis's former boss. We pray that you'll continue to bless him and his health and his family. Give us a good night's rest, Father, and bless us tomorrow, and that we might glorify you and your Son and reflect our love for him by obeying his commands. We're thankful, Father, for the hope of heaven. In his name we pray. Amen.